For roughly 18 months, there was a woman in the United States who could pick up a telephone and reach the President of the United States, and pick up a different telephone and reach the most powerful gangster in Chicago. Not a rumor, not a novel. The White House kept logs, 70 contacts, her name, in the President's own appointment books, in his secretary's records, in FBI files with her address typed at the top. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The Federal Bureau of Investigation knew. Edgar Hoover knew. He put it on paper, walked it into the White House, and had lunch with John F. Kennedy about it. Nobody told the American people. Not that year. Not that decade. By the time she finally said it out loud, all of it, the meetings, the envelopes, the cash, every man who could have confirmed her story was dead. One shot 6 times around the mouth in his own basement, one folded into an oil drum in a Florida bay, and one shot in Dallas. This is the story of a woman who had the truth in her hands for separate times, and let it slip through her fingers for separate times. Some of those times, she had no choice. Some of those times, she did. She was born Judith Eileen Catherine Imore on January 11, 1934, in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Her father Frederick was an architect of German descent. Her mother Catherine was Irish. She was one of several children in a house that, by every account, was ordinary in the way that American houses in the 1930s were ordinary. A little cramped, a little hopeful, a father chasing contracts. Then the contracts came. West Coast developers, the post-war building boom. Money that arrived faster than anyone in that family had ever seen it arrive. And the Imores moved to Pacific Palisades, on the western edge of Los Angeles, where the streets curled down toward the ocean and the neighbors. In those years, were people whose faces were 40 feet tall in movie theaters. Bob Hope lived nearby. He became a family friend. There's a detail here that most tellings skip, and I think it matters more than the famous neighbors. When Judith was 14, her mother was nearly killed in a car accident. Judith withdrew from school. She was tutored at home after that. She never went back to a normal classroom, never had the ordinary friction of adolescence, the ordinary friends, the ordinary practice of being an ordinary person. Think about what that does to a girl. She grows up beautiful, in a neighborhood full of famous men, with no peer group, and no social floor beneath her except the one her looks and her family name provide. Her older sister Jacqueline goes into pictures under the name Susan Morrow and makes her screen debut in 1951. And the door to that world swings open for Judith too. And it swings open easy, and nobody ever teaches her what's on the other side of it. At 18, in 1952, she married the actor William Campbell. He was 29. She was still, in every meaningful sense, a girl who had been pulled out of school at 14. The marriage lasted 6 years. They divorced in 1958. She kept the name, and for the next decades of her life, most of America would know her as Judith Campbell. Now here's the first door. If her mother doesn't crash that car, if Judith stays in school, graduates with a class, builds a life with some gravity of its own, does she end up at Puccini's on Beverly Drive in 1959, catching the eye of Frank Sinatra? Maybe. Los Angeles is a small town when you're that beautiful, but the version of her that walked into that restaurant was a young woman with no anchor whatsoever. And men like Sinatra could read that from across a room. They always can, the way I see it. The first door in this story closed before Judith Campbell ever met a president. It closed when a 14-year-old stopped going to school and started learning about the world exclusively from people who wanted something from her. She would spend the next 40 years being believed by no one and used by everyone. And it started at a restaurant with a singer. Sinatra was not a passing figure in her life. He was the hinge. They had a brief romance in 1959. Brief is the word she used. But what she got out of Frank Sinatra was not a relationship. It was an address book. In 1960, Sinatra was at the absolute center of a Venn diagram that has fascinated Americans ever since. Hollywood, Las Vegas, the Kennedy family, and the Chicago outfit. He was friends with all four. He moved between them like a man who had a key to every door in the building. And in the space of a few weeks, he handed Judith Campbell two of those keys. February 7, 1960, Las Vegas, the Sands Hotel. Sinatra introduces her to a United States Senator from Massachusetts who is, at that exact moment, running for President of the United States. His name is John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He's 42 years old. He's married, and by her account, and by the account of a good deal of documentary evidence that came later, the affair begins almost immediately. A few months after that, in Miami, by most accounts, Sinatra introduces her to a soft-spoken man he calls Sam Flood. Sam Flood was not Sam Flood. Sam Flood was Salvatore Giancana. Momo, Sam the Cigar, the boss of the Chicago outfit, heir to Capone's machine, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful organized crime figures in the United States. She did not know, not at first. That is one of the few claims in this entire saga that basically everyone, her defenders and her critics, accepts as plausible, because it is exactly how men like Giancana operated. He gave a false name. He was gentle with her. He was patient. He was, by her description, a good listener, which is not a quality people associate with mob bosses, but is very much a quality that made them effective. And this is the second door, and it's the strangest one in the story, because it's a door that opened when it should have stayed shut. Sinatra introduced a young woman to a presidential candidate. Then Sinatra introduced the same young woman to the boss of the Chicago outfit. Within a single election year, whether he did it deliberately, whether he understood what he was building, whether he was simply a man who introduced everyone to everyone because that was his social currency, we do not know. Sinatra took that with him. Here's what I think. I don't believe Frank Sinatra sat down and designed a covert channel between the President of the United States and the American Mafia using a 26-year-old former model's The Wire. I think he did something much more human and much more careless. I think he was showing off. I think he wanted the Kennedys to know he could deliver anything, and he wanted Chicago to know he was close to the next president. And Judith Campbell was a way to demonstrate both. Careless people build the machinery that careful people would never dare to build. And once that machinery existed, somebody was always going to use it. Let's separate what is documented from what is claimed, because this is where most retellings of this story go badly wrong in both directions. Here is what is documented. White House records show that between roughly late 1960 and the spring of 1962, there were on the order of 70 telephone contacts between Judith Campbell and the White House. Not 70 calls she says she made. 70 logged. Kennedy's personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, maintained a line through which women could reach the president, and Judith Campbell used it. She visited the White House. She is in the records, FBI files, Secret Service documentation, and White House staff records all corroborate that this woman and this president knew each other, spoke frequently, and met in person on numerous occasions. That is not a claim. That is paper. Now here is what is claimed, and only claimed, that the relationship was sexual, sustained, and lasted roughly 2 years, that she was with him on the campaign trail in 1960 and continued to see him after the inauguration, that she met him inside the White House residence for private encounters, that he spoke to her about other women, and that he was, her word, relentless about it. She claimed, among other things, that Kennedy brought prostitutes to the White House swimming pool. Kennedy's inner circle denied all of it. Ferociously, Dave Powers, the president's special assistant, who she said arranged the meetings, flatly stated that Kennedy never had an affair with her. Frank Sinatra, the man who by her account made the introduction in the first place, publicly dismissed her entirely. His line was famous, and it was cruel, and it was very good, in the way that cruel lines often are. Hell hath no fury like a hustler with a literary agent. And this is where I want to be precise, because being precise is the only thing that separates history from gossip. Sinatra's line implies a motive, that she made it up to sell a book, But that gets the sequence exactly backwards, and the sequence is checkable. Judith Campbell did not step forward with a manuscript. Her name surfaced in federal investigative material she had no control over. She was dragged into daylight by a Senate committee, and the leak to the Washington Post. The book came after. The book came because there was already a national story with her name on it, and no version of events from her in it. That doesn't make everything she wrote true. It does make Sinatra's explanation false. He offered a theory of her motive that could not survive a calendar. And the deeper problem with the denials is this: the corroborating documents came out over decades, and every wave of them made her more credible on the core fact, not less. The people who called her a liar in 1977 were, on the central question of whether she and the President of the United States were involved, wrong. Which brings us to the man who knew all of it, years before anyone else, and did nothing with it in public. Edgar Hoover had been director of the FBI since 1924. By 1962, he had outlasted 7 presidents, and he had done it by understanding one thing better than anyone in Washington: information about a powerful man's private life is not gossip, it's leverage. The Bureau was wiretapping and surveilling Sam Giancana intensively in this period, as part of the government's broad assault on organized crime, an assault, worth noting, that was being personally driven by the president's own brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. And in the course of watching Giancana, the FBI kept running into the same young woman's name. And in the course of watching that young woman, the FBI kept running into telephone calls to the White House. In late February 1962, Hoover put it in writing, and on March 22, 1962, Hoover had lunch with President John F. Kennedy. We do not have a transcript. We do not have a witness who has credibly described the conversation. What we have is the shape of the thing, and the shape is unmistakable. The FBI director came to lunch holding a file that connected the President of the United States, through a shared mistress, to the boss of the Chicago outfit. Here is the fact that makes the hair on your arm stand up. After March 22, 1962, the White House phone logs record no further calls from Judith Campbell. That's the door. That's the biggest closed door in this entire story, and almost nobody talks about it, because it's a door that closed quietly. Sit with that for a second. In March of 1962, the scandal that could have ended the Kennedy presidency existed in complete form, in a manila folder, in the hands of a man who did not particularly like the Kennedys. Everything the public would eventually learn in 1975 and 1977 and 1988 was already known, already written down, already delivered, 13 years early. What if Hoover had leaked it? Run that hypothetical honestly, because it's not a small one. It's the spring of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is 7 months away. If the President of the United States is publicly destroyed in March 1962 over a mistress shared with Sam Giancana, then in October of that year, the man managing the closest approach to nuclear war in human history is somebody else. Maybe Lyndon Johnson. Maybe a weakened Kennedy with no political capital and a Congress smelling blood. The naval quarantine, the back channel to Khrushchev, the 13 days of refusing his own general's demand for airstrikes, all of that gets decided by a different man, or by the same man with nothing left to spend. I want to be careful here. I am not telling you Hoover saved the world by keeping a secret. I'm telling you something less flattering and, I think, more true. The survival of the Kennedy presidency through 1962 depended, in part, on the discretion of a man who was keeping the secret for his own reasons. Hoover didn't protect Kennedy. Hoover owned him. And you can be owned by a man and still be lucky he chose not to sell. The affair ended. The calls stopped. And Judith Campbell walked out of the most powerful man's life and back into the other ones. She had no idea that the worst part hadn't started yet. 13 years pass. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Judith Campbell, now living quietly, still trailed by federal agents who periodically want to talk to her, watches the country turn a dead president into a myth. She says nothing for a long time, nothing at all. Then the 70s arrive, and the American government starts investigating itself. In 1975, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. Everyone calls it the Church Committee, after its chairman Frank Church of Idaho begins pulling the CIA apart in public. And one of the things it finds is almost too strange to be real. In 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency recruited the American Mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro. Real operation, real money, real people. Among the mobsters brought in, Johnny Rosselli, the outfit's man in Las Vegas and Hollywood, and Sam Giancana himself. So now the committee has a president who is dead, a CIA murder plot against a foreign head of state, and a set of mobsters who were simultaneously working for the United States government and being prosecuted by it. Sam Giancana is scheduled to testify on June 19, 1975, at his home in Oak Park, Illinois. Sam Giancana is shot in the back of the head while cooking sausage and peppers in his basement kitchen. Then the killer fires 5 more rounds into his face, in a circle around the mouth. That is not a random detail. In the language of that world, shooting a man around the mouth is a sentence with a meaning, and the meaning is, this one talked, whether it was actually about the church committee, or about outfit politics, or about money. That has never been resolved, and I'm not going to pretend it has. But he died days before he was due in front of the Senate. And that is a fact you don't have to decorate. Johnny Rosselli does testify more than once, and in his testimony, he says something that lands like a match in a dry field. A close friend of President Kennedy's was also close to the mob. The committee doesn't print her name. The Washington Post gets it anyway. William Safire puts it in the New York Times. And in December 1975, Judith, married since that year to a golfer named Dan Exner, and now legally Judith Exner, becomes the most hunted woman in America. She's subpoenaed, she testifies, and she lies. She holds a press conference and denies any knowledge of Mafia involvement with the president. She says the relationship with Kennedy was personal, private, romantic, nothing more. She says Giancana never asked her for anything. She says Rosselli was simply a friend. This is the door I think about the most. Because in December 1975, she had something she would never have again. A national platform, a legal obligation to tell the truth, live coverage, and a country that was in the exact mood to believe terrible things about its own government. Watergate was 1 year old. The CIA was being disassembled on live television. If Judith Exner had walked into that room and said, under oath, I carried envelopes between John Kennedy and Sam Giancana, and here is where and here is when, she would have been the most consequential witness of the decade. Instead, she said no. And the reason she said no is not mysterious. Sam Giancana had been dead for 6 months, killed in the manner reserved for men who talk. The following summer, July 1976, Johnny Rosselli would have dinner with Santo Trafficante in Fort Lauderdale, disappear 2 days later, and be found on August 7, 1976, in a 55-gallon steel drum in Dunfermline Bay. His legs sawn off, chains wrapped around the body. Ask yourself what you would have said in that room. Here's what I think, and it's the least fashionable position available on this story. I think her lie in 1975 was the single most rational decision Judith Exner ever made, and I think it destroyed her. Those are not contradictions. She bought her life with the only currency she had, her credibility, and she spent all of it in one transaction, and there was nothing left in the account for the rest of her life. Every single thing she said afterward would be measured against the day she raised her hand and said the opposite. In 1977, she published Judith Exner, My Story, written with the crime journalist Arvid Demris, and the book is a strange artifact, because it is simultaneously braver than anyone gave her credit for, and more cowardly than the moment required. Brave, because it put the affair with a canonized president on the record in permanent form. in an era when the Kennedy myth was close to sacred, and she knew exactly what would be done to her for it. And it was done to her. Kennedy loyalists went after her with genuine viciousness. Sinatra delivered his line about the hustler and the literary agent. Dave Powers denied it flatly. The press treated her as a punchline, a party girl with a tape recorder, cowardly, because on the central question, the mob, the envelopes, the meetings, she held the line she'd taken under oath. She wrote that the relationship with Kennedy was entirely personal. She wrote that Giancana never asked her for anything about Kennedy. She wrote that Rosalie was a friend. So the 1977 book is a myth correction that stops halfway. It corrects the myth of the flawless president. It establishes, permanently, that John Kennedy conducted an active extramarital life inside the White House, which we now know from a dozen independent directions is simply true. But it protects the myth that mattered more to the men who could kill her. And meanwhile, in the private life running underneath all of this, things were coming apart in ways she rarely discussed. She had a child during these years, and did not raise him. The pressure, the agents, the reporters, the phone that rang at 3 in the morning with nobody on the other end. She cited that as the reason they reconnected later in her life, which I think is worth saying out loud, because in a story this cynical, that's one of the very few things that went right. She kept records. This is the detail journalists who investigated her always came back to, sometimes grudgingly. She was meticulous. Date books, notes, documentation, kept from the 60s onward, because after the breakups with Kennedy and with Giancana, she believed she might be killed. She kept the papers under her bed. She kept a pistol under her pillow. A woman who is inventing a story does not usually keep a filing system, but a woman who is frightened for 20 years does not usually stay entirely well, either. And that is exactly what happened next. In 1988, Judith Exner sat down with Kitty Kelly for People magazine, and she took it all back. She said she had lied to the church committee. She said she had lied in her own book. She said she had done it because she was afraid of the Mafia. And given the state of Sam Giancana's face and the location of Johnny Roselli's body, that explanation requires no embroidery. And then she told the version she said was true. She said that in 1960, during the presidential campaign, John Kennedy asked her to make contact with Sam Giancana, and that she arranged a meeting between them. She said that for roughly 18 months, she served as the link between the candidate, and later the president, and the Chicago outfit. She said she crossed the country, carrying envelopes between them. She said she arranged something like 10 meetings between Kennedy and Giancana. The affair, in other words, was not the story. The affair was the cover for the story. That's the third man, not a lover in the ordinary sense, not a rival, not another Kennedy. The third man in the room was Salvatore Giancana. And if Judith Exner was telling the truth in 1988, then the relationship America had spent a decade treating as a tabloid embarrassment was actually the transmission belt of a covert arrangement between the presidency of the United States and organized crime. She went further in later accounts. She said the envelopes concerned the plot against Fidel Castro, that the meetings she arranged were about the operation the church committee had exposed. She said some of the envelopes she carried from Kennedy to Giancana contained cash, and she said, or implied, what a lot of people in Chicago had been saying quietly for years, that the outfit helped deliver the 1960 election, and that Kennedy owed for it in 1997. In a Vanity Fair interview with Liz Smith and in conversations with the investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, she added more. She said Kennedy had discussed his Cuba plans with her directly. She said she had carried payoffs from California defense contractors not only to the president but to his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And she said that after her final encounter with Kennedy in 1962, she became pregnant and terminated the pregnancy. That is an extraordinary body of allegation, and I'm going to do the thing that this channel exists to do, which is to tell you honestly how much of it stands up. There are 3 serious positions on Judith Exner's claims, and any honest treatment has to lay out all three, including the evidence against the one you find most attractive. Position 1. She was substantially telling the truth in 1988 and 1997. The evidence for it, the core relationship is documented beyond dispute. 70-odd contacts, White House visits, FBI files. Her relationships with Giancana and Rosselli are equally documented. The Bureau was watching all three. The CIA Mafia plot against Castro is not a theory. It is a finding of the United States Senate, and Giancana and Rosselli were in it. The timing lines up. The plot is being assembled in 1960 and 1961, which is exactly the window she describes. Both potential corroborating witnesses were murdered before the story could be tested. Her fear was demonstrably rational, and her records were, by the account of journalists who examined them, unusually disciplined. Position 2. She told the truth about the affair and invented the rest. This is the position taken most rigorously by the historian Michael O'Brien, whose essay The Exner File ran in the Washington Monthly in December 1999, 3 months after her death. And it is not a hostile hatchet job. It's a careful sorting, the evidence for it. The escalation pattern is troubling. In 1975, she said nothing happened. In 1977, she said it was a love affair. In 1988, she said she was a courier. In 1997, she added defense contractor payoffs, Robert Kennedy, and direct presidential briefings on Cuba. Each version is more dramatic, and each version arrives further from the events. Critically, the documentary support does not scale with the claims. The phone logs and FBI files corroborate contact, and contact is all they corroborate. There is no document that says what was in an envelope, and a witness produced in the 1990s who appeared to support her account of carrying money to Giancana later withdrew his story. A serious blow. And it landed in the same period when Seymour Hersh's Kennedy research was badly damaged by a separate set of documents that turned out to be forgeries, which is worth stating plainly, because it goes to how much weight that whole 1997 wave can carry. Add to that her personal condition. She had struggled with depression, instability, and paranoia going back to the 60s. By 1997, she was being treated for breast cancer. Critics used that against her. Position 3. She was telling the truth, and she was systematically discredited. The evidence for it. Every wave of new documentation from the 70s onward moved in her direction on the facts that could be checked. The people calling her a liar were, repeatedly, the people with the most to lose. Kennedy's own staff denied things we now know happened, and the argument from illness cuts both ways. A woman being treated for cancer, with a documented history of being surveilled and threatened for 20 years, is a person whose fear is explained by her circumstances, not a person whose testimony is automatically void. Discrediting a witness by pointing at her mental health is one of the oldest instruments in the drawer. So where does that leave us? Here's what I think, and I want to be as exact as I can be. I think the affair happened. That's not a belief. That's a conclusion from documents, and anyone still calling it a fantasy in the 2020s is arguing with the paperwork. I think the contact between Kennedy's world and Giancana's world through Judith Campbell happened, because the FBI thought it was happening, and Hoover thought it was serious enough to carry into the White House and put in front of the president over lunch. Hoover did not schedule confrontations with presidents over nothing, and I think what was inside the envelopes is a genuine open case, and I don't believe anyone alive can close it. It may have been cash. It may have been messages about Cuba. It may have been, on some trips, nothing more than a note from a man to a mistress, passed through the only channel he trusted, and remembered 40 years later as something larger by a woman who had spent for decades being told her life didn't count for anything. All three of those can be true, different Tuesdays, in 1961. That's what makes it an open case, rather than a scandal. What I will not do is what both camps did to her. The Kennedy loyalists needed her to be a liar, so the myth would hold. The conspiracy writers needed her to be a perfect witness, so the theory would hold. Both sides wanted a simpler woman, than the one who actually existed. Let's put the doors in a row, because the shape only appears when you see them together. The first door was 1948, when a 14-year-old left school or her mother's car accident and never developed a life that belonged to her. The second door was February 7, 1960, and a few months later in Miami, when one man with an address book handed her a president and a crime boss inside a single election year, and, I'd argue, never once considered what he was building. The third door was March 22, 1962, Hoover's lunch, the day the whole thing could have detonated in real time, with living witnesses, with the president available to answer for it, with a functioning press and a Senate and an electorate. Instead it was filed, and a story that could have been adjudicated in 1962, while everyone was alive, was deferred to 1975, by which point Kennedy had been dead for 12 years. Giancana had 6 months to live, and Roselli had 18. The fourth door was that Senate hearing room in December 1975, when she had immunity, a subpoena, a microphone, and a country ready to believe her, and lied, for reasons any reasonable person would have found compelling, and thereby made every later word she said contestable. The fifth door was 1977, the book that told half. The sixth was 1988, when she finally told it, and the two men who could have confirmed or destroyed her account had been in the ground for more than a decade. And the seventh was 1997, when she said the most explosive things she ever said, in the worst possible year to say them, sick, exhausted, with a supporting witness who recanted. None of these were fated. Every one of them was a human decision, hers, Sinatra's, Hoover's, Kennedy's, and the decision of a whole professional class of Washington men who found it easier to call one woman a liar than to check what she was saying. And here's the part that gets me. The historical loss here is not really about Judith Exner's reputation. It's about a question the United States has never been able to answer, and now probably never will. What, exactly, was the relationship between the Kennedy White House and the Chicago outfit in 1960 and 1961? Because we know for certain that the CIA was in business with the Mafia to kill a head of state. We know for certain that the president's brother was simultaneously prosecuting that same Mafia harder than anyone in American history. Those two facts sit in the same building at the same time, and they should not be able to coexist. There was one person alive who claimed to have walked between those rooms carrying the mail, and America spent 40 years arguing about whether she was a slut. That's not a moral judgment I'm making about anyone in particular. That is a description of what happened to the evidence. She and Dan Exner separated in 1988, the same year as the People interview, which cannot be a coincidence, though we know almost nothing about the private details, and I'm not going to invent them. They never reconciled. She had no other public relationship for the rest of her life. She bought a house in Newport Beach. She started painting. I find that detail and reasonably moving. A woman whose entire public identity had been built out of other people's descriptions of her. The model, the mistress, the party girl, the witness, the liar. Spent her last years making things that were hers, that nobody else had a version of. The breast cancer that had been treated in the mid-90s returned and moved fast. On September 24, 1999, Judith Exner died in Duarte, California, at the age of 65. She gave interviews near the end, and she did not apologize. She defended her choices. The men, the silence, the disclosures, the timing of the disclosures. She said she had exactly one regret, and it wasn't the mob, and it wasn't the Senate, and it wasn't the book. She said the worst thing she ever did was fall in love with a married man. Read that again, because it is doing something more sophisticated than it looks. She's not confessing to a scandal. She's refusing the frame entirely. Everyone else in this story spent 40 years arguing about power. Who knew? Who lied? Who ordered what? She kept insisting that from the inside, it had never been about power. It had been about a man she loved who was never going to be hers, and about the fact that loving him cost her, by any accounting, the rest of her life. Michael O'Brien titled his essay Truth and Fantasy from a President's Mistress, and I think that's right, but I'd flip the emphasis. The fantasy in this story was never really hers. The fantasy was Camelot, a presidency so luminous that anyone who described its actual furniture had to be lying. She spent her life colliding with that fantasy, and it broke her, and it turned out she'd been right about the furniture the whole time. The men in this story all got endings that matched their power. Kennedy got Dallas and the myth, Giancana got 6 shots and the legend, Rosalie got an oil drum, and a chapter in every mob book written since. Judith Exner got a house in Newport Beach, a set of paintbrushes, a box of records under the bed, and a country that never quite decided whether to believe her. The worst thing I did was fall in love with a married man. That's the whole case, in her words. And the case is still open. Thanks for watching. If a story like this one is your kind of history, the near misses, the doors that closed, the witnesses nobody listened to, hit subscribe, because we do this every week. And if you want to know what happened to the man on the other end of those envelopes, watch our episode on the CIA's Mafia plot against Fidel Castro next.